Yea, believe in me and ye shall find peace.
Yeah. We've heard that crap for about 2,000 years now. We want to hear something new. Yeah!
Well, what do you want?
We want to see...
Abraxas.
Yeah, with our own eyes. Yeah!
We followed blindly for thousands of years and...
Yeah!
Right!
Oh, let me think about that for a minute.
Oh, my Father, Lord of silence, supreme God of desolation, though mankind reviles, yet aches to embrace, strengthen my purpose to save the world from a second ordeal of Jesus Christ and his grubby, mundane creed.
Every week, I wonder if you, my beloved truth seekers, are getting as tired as a whore on dollar night of the same introductions. Just as every week I promise myself that this time I'll keep my insufferable prating at under 15 minutes. What are your thoughts, since thinking tends to give me hemorrhoids? I do try hard to do some variance in my monologues. So here I go again, as Whitesnake sang, and I'm sure David Coverdale named the band after an Ophite sect or an obscure Nag Hammadi passage. Of course. But here I go again.
You don't have a soul!
Each weekend, you incarnate at the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West, through that psychonaut portal called the God Above God Dad Cam. Here Abraxas takes you on an odyssey of holy heresy to hear the orations of the best and the brightest, the bold and the blasphemous, the greatest luminaries of our times in distilling the Gnostic wisdom of the ages. This is where you come to learn how to write your own gospel and live your own myths. This is where you gain the gnosis to finally overcome the holographic, virtual unreality, inner and outer systems that have enslaved you for lifetimes. This is where the revolution of the spirit and the mind begins. This is where we fight them. This is where we make our last stand. And this is Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio.
What's the journey I have to make? You have to make. Each of us has to make. You talk about something called the soul's high adventure.
Follow your bliss. Find where it is and don't be afraid to follow it.
Abraxas is, of course, yours falsely, Miguel Connor, a recovering addict, sci-fi hack, failed scholar, hobbit podcaster, and not exactly a jack of all trades, but more like a jack of all offs.
The rebellious son.
And this program is edgy, politically incorrect, and devilishly stereotyping, because it's one of the best methods to catch your attention, since those red pills get harder and harder to digest because social networking has crucified our attention span between the thieves of corporate media and political Punch and Judy games.
Shh! I need silence to mind meld with the internet.
Also, McDonald's spirituality has accustomed us to prepackaged iCarly answers to our many challenges, as well as shallow spiritual practices that ultimately have the effect on our soul as watching an episode of Ren and Stimpy. And lastly, Lion King theology that wants us to believe we are all one, except it doesn't tell us which one of us in the one is supposed to do the thinking. So we kick the individuality can down the road to the best dressed guru or cleric or YouTube soundbite.
It might be true that there are 6 billion people in the world and counting. Nevertheless, what you do makes a difference. It makes a difference, first of all, in material terms, makes a difference to other people, and it sets an example. And in short, I think the message here is that we should never simply write ourselves off and see ourselves as the victim of various forces. It's always our decision who we are.
Basically, I'm handing out jagged little red pills. And plus it annoys the true servants of Yaldabaoth. You know, those who are easily offended, soaked in self-importance, and wear designer halos made from organic spiritual material, but put together by underage slave angels in heaven. Those who control you with their lukewarm rhetoric that makes you believe you're a wonderful snowflake in a crystal globe, when in reality we are fallen shards of infinity trapped in the bodies of dying mammals who cannot be redeemed by our own means. Or humanity would have done that a long time ago.
Like the dinosaur. Look out that window. You had your time. The future is our world, Morpheus. The future is our time.
We need to hear the call of Hagia Sophia. That is the true gnosis, that pathless labyrinth, that very indirect experience with the divine. Since anyone with direct access to God, whether it's George Bush or Deepak Chopra or Reverend Moon, has either had their brains fried because of the intensity of beholding infinity all at once, if they're saying the truth, or are really speaking to archons of delusion if they are not saying the truth.
Why can't I worship the Lord in my own way, by praying like hell on my deathbed?
Homer, they can hear you inside.
Relax, those pious morons are too busy talking to their phony baloney God. How you doing? Peace be with you. Praise Jeebus.
No, my beloved truth seekers, gnosis is the transformative, sublimating odyssey towards the divine. It is not the result, but what brings those results of soul liberation. And it is a slow burn, acquaintance with the fullness of the unknown God. The treatise of resurrection summarizes well what I just said when it proclaims, strong is the system of the pleroma, small is that which broke loose and became the world. Kind of sounds like Yoda was writing this scripture, you know? Strong is the system of the pleroma.
Douchebag you are. Bend over and show me your dark side.
But let us to today's topic and astral guest, my beloved truth seekers. On this approximately Saturday, July 23rd, the year of our demiurge 2011, we are ennobled by Gary Greenberg to deconstruct and understand the four Gospels, based on his optimal new book, Who Wrote the Gospels? Why New Testament Scholars Challenge Church Traditions. Gary is also the author of The Judas Brief, The Moses Mystery, The Egyptian Origins of the Jewish People, and 101 Myths of the Bible, How Ancient Scribes Invented Biblical History, as well as president of the Biblical Archaeology Society of New York.
Careful, Chief. You dig up the past, all you get is dirty.
For more information on Gary and his provocative and evocative work, please visit his website, BibleandHistory.com. This is the third time Gary visits the virtual Alexandria and makes his case in our Agora. He appeared in Aeon Byte 101 to discuss the Judas Brief, which revealed that the Gospels were cruelly modified to wholesale blame the Jews for the death of Jesus and exonerate the Romans from any guilt, like Goldman and Sachs CEOs.
Big nose!
And he joined us on Aeon Byte number 93 to discuss 101 Myths of the Bible, where he ties in almost every story of the Old Testament to a previous Egyptian or Sumerian myth. Truly a wet dream for any mythicist or adherent of mythology.
All pay heed! The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 15 10 commandments for all to obey.
Certainly recommend you check out these books and download those episodes. And I certainly believe Gary's new book, Who Wrote the Gospels, should be in the reading basket by your toilet for anyone interested in sober ancient Christian scholarship. I would certainly put it up there with Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus, G.A. Wells' Can We Trust the New Testament, Randall Helm's Gospel Fiction, and Robert Price's The Incredibly Shrinking Son of Man. I would actually put it higher because Gary nimbly gives us a panoptic view of New Testament scholarship in less than 150 pages.
The Bible is basic instructions before leaving Earth. TM. Put that shit on a t-shirt.
One night of reading, and you'll run out of your ready-to-be-foreclosed house to your nearest fundagelical, maybe a Mormon bishop, and bet him one of his wives you can beat any of his apologetics. You'll easily win and gain yourself a nice gal who can't read, but you can primp up for your latest steampunk convention. Then you can hand her over to the nearest Wiccan coven that will, further destroy her brain. Okay, just send her to the Gnostic International Tribunal, or GIT for short, where we will reprogram, offer her a new life, yes.
Wendy and I think that was a sexist statement.
Well, I'm sorry, Wendy, but I just don't trust anything that bleeds for 5 days and doesn't die.
And if you're a woman after reading Gary's book, find a militant fundy and then bet his gun collection or deeds to his training grounds in the Ozarks. And then use that place to start a superhero group that vanquishes Wiccan and radical Mormon groups, or Mormon Wiccan hybrid organizations.
Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition!
Despite orthodoxy's claims, there are still many open questions concerning the 4 canonical Gospels, including their authorship, dating, theology, and original versions. But in our interview, we'll get inside the knickers of each of the 4 Gospels and fondle them deeply to find their closest origins and original manifestations. We'll understand the Synoptic Problem and how scholars solve it, why the 4 Gospels were chosen over many other texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Q source and alternative theories, the Gospel of John and whether the author even knew of the other 3, and much more that most lay people have not heard of. We'll also deal with the many tendentious scribal modifications that radically change many of the Gospel's doctrines, and much more, I say.
Yea, so you say. But one who sits amongst us has already betrayed me this night. Who?
Who can it be?
Judas! Do you want a beverage? Try the mulled wine. It's terrific.
No! Leave us alone! Go!
And in the end, the historical Jesus will still be lost to us, my beloved truth seekers. He's just a patchwork character, a mouthpiece of various ancient theologies and philosophies that include traditional, mystic, and apocalyptic Judaism, Hellenistic mysticism, Stoicism and cynicism, and certainly Gnosticism. And I'm sure I'm leaving some out.
Your tiny Jesus, your golden fleece diapers with your tiny little fat balled up fist pawing.
He was a man. He had a beard.
Look, I like the baby version the best. Do you hear me?
And that includes the Gospel of Tommy. Although many modern Gnostics are too stubborn to accept this and still think it's a monolithic scripture, they end up making these wild interpretations of some of the sayings that make less sense than the plot to the Wolverine movie, and then act like Daleks on the rag if you challenge them.
Exterminate!
The truth is that Jesus was, is, and always will be a projection of our own hopes and potentials, individually and as a culture, as well as both a projection of our divine spark and our shadow. Left-wingers give us the social worker, communist, and Burning Man attending Jesus, while right-wingers bring us the Garth Brooks, hell-threatening, Jehovah in drag Jesus. It was Albert Schweitzer in the opening pages of his famous book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, who wrote, "And so each subsequent epoch in theology found its own ideas in Jesus, and could find no other way of bringing him to life. Not only epochs found themselves in him, each individual recreated him in the image of his own personality."
I like to picture Jesus in a tuxedo t-shirt because it says like, I want to be formal, but I'm here to party too. Because I like to party, so I like my Jesus to party.
At least the Gnostic Jesus, as represented by the Valentinians and Sethians, is far more consistent. We know he's an alien entity from a meta-dimension of light, who descends to this vale of tears and puts on a monkey suit. He is more of a hierophant, like Hermes Trismegistus, than a suicidal emo god, who imparts mysteries to those who have ears to hear. He battles the archons, with the cross of wood and the cross of light being the nexus of this cosmic war. He saves Sophia, and sometimes is saved by Sophia.
I like to picture Jesus as a ninja fighting off evil samurai.
I like to think of Jesus like with giant eagle's wings and singing lead vocals for Leonard Skinner with like an angel band. And I'm in the front row and I'm hammered drunk.
He is the reason of the divine, who wants us to use our reason, higher and lower, so we can experience the radiance of the treasury of light. Of course, there are variances and disputes in interpreting the logos, as Gnostics were wont to do, but not this Rorschach Jesus we find in the Bible. Yet in a sense, the Gnostics knew that society was always meant to have its own Depeche Mode Jesus, and that each one would see him differently, because like I said, nosis is an indirect experience to the supernal, and we all have different spiritual needs and tastes and velocities.
There are two kinds of sufferers in this world: those who suffer from a lack of life and those who suffer from an overabundance of life.
Here are some examples. From the Gospel of Thomas, number 13, Jesus said to his disciples, "Compare me to something and tell me what I am like." Simon Peter said to him, "You are like a just messenger." Matthew said to him, "You are like a wise philosopher." Thomas said to him, "Teacher, my mouth is utterly unable to say what you are like." Good answer, Tommy. You sure play a mean kiss-ass ball.
See me, feel me.
And from the Gospel of Philip, Jesus took them all by stealth, for he did not appear as he was, but in the manner in which they would be able to see him. He appeared to them all. He appeared to the great as great. He appeared to the small as small. He appeared to the angels as an angel, and to men as a man. Because of this, his word hid itself from everyone. Some indeed saw him, thinking they were seeing themselves.
Lois, don't get alarmed, but I think I might be Jesus.
And lastly, from the secret book of Juan, while the beloved disciple is hiding in a cave like a pussy because he just saw Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Behold, the heavens open, and the whole creation which is below heaven shone, and the world was shaken. I was afraid, and behold, I saw in the light a youth who stood by me. While I looked at him, he became like an old man, and he changed his likeness again, becoming like a servant. There was not a plurality before me, but there was a likeness with multiple forms in the light, and the likeness appeared through each other, and the likeness had 3 forms.
There can be only one.
He said to me, John, John, why do you doubt? Or why are you afraid? You are not unfamiliar with this image, are you? That is, do not be timid. I am the one who is with you always. I am the Father. I am the Mother. I am the Son. I am the undefiled and incorruptible one. Now I have come to teach you what is, and what was, and what will come to pass, that you may know the things which are not revealed, and those which are revealed, and to teach you concerning the unwavering race of the perfect man.
Eternity isn't some later time. Eternity isn't a long time. Eternity has nothing to do with time. Eternity is that dimension of here and now, which thinking in time cuts out.
This is it.
This is it.
This is my...
If you don't get it here, you won't get it anywhere.
Carl Jung, in his book Aeon, summarizes what Christ really means in all times and places. He writes, our discourse necessarily brings us to Christ, because he is still the living myth of our culture. He is our culture hero who, regardless of his historical existence, embodies the myth of the divine primordial man, the mystic Adam. He is in us and we in him. His kingdom is the pearl of great price, the treasure buried in the field, the grain of mustard seed which will become a great tree, and the heavenly city. As Christ is in us, so also is his heavenly kingdom.
You said it, man. Nobody fucks with the Jesus.
Other than that, I'd like to thank the recent support in all types I've received after expressing my concerns with continuing with Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. Not only have I actually broken even for the first time in years, the counsel of many of you has been solemn and wise. I am eternally grateful for those guarding my back, as I hopefully have gotten your back in a civilization in crisis and the modern human psyche fragmenting collectively.
Mankind's been trying to kill each other off since the beginning of time. Now, we finally have the power to finish the job.
You've certainly given me much to reflect on when I go on hiatus, hopefully in August, although I have to check my commitments. I never break my word to guests or book publicists, and certainly break my balls for them with pleasure. After all, one of Aeon Byte's goals has always been to give a voice to those ignored by the mainstream media and its shibboleth Qurans of mediocrity.
Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
So please continue to support this Thumbelina venture in any way you can. Downloading shows, purchasing Voices of Gnosticism, or my novel Stargazer, now only $3.99 on Kindle since we're preparing to release the sequel Heretic this fall. Buying or downloading the Gospel of Thomas album, offering any service you can, and, of course, donating a shekel or two when you have the means. Kidnapping a rich Mormon bishop or Wiccan high priestess wouldn't hurt either, as the Gnostic International Tribunal could find many uses for them.
Have you ever been in a Turkish prison?
This is not easy for me to say, believe me. Paul brought the gospel without charge, but he needed to make tents to make ends meet and deal with Peter and James on financial deals for the needy. I know I can't serve two masters, but I also know that there is hopefully the goddess Mat holding the right balance for all of us so we can continue with the Gnostic revolution and save Hypatia of Alexandria from the Christian mob once and for all.
Even the smallest person can change the course of the future.
Divided we stand, together we rise. And let us run with those searching for the truth one more time and avoid those who claim to have found it. Since truth is eternity and experiencing eternity is truth, let us continue seeing through a glass darkly no more. But enough of my drivel. Gary Greenberg on his new book, Who Wrote the Gospels. And yes, I did promise you some sort of new introduction, and I did promise that I would keep it under 15 minutes, which I see is not the case. There go my promises. Down the toilet faster than an abortion on prom night. And yes, even that joke I've recycled many times. Oh dear. Death spares none but the tiger.
The Lord of Hosts, the stranger from the manger, the hardest working man in the afterlife. Give it up for Jesus!
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure of being joined once again by Gary Greenberg to discuss his new book, Who Wrote the Gospels? Why New Testament Scholars Challenge Church Traditions. How are you doing today, Gary?
Good. How are we all?
We're all doing what we can. But once again, thank you very much for coming back. So tell us, Gary, why did you decide to write Who Wrote the Gospels? And what perhaps separates your new book from other scholarly works that deconstruct the four canonical Gospels?
Well, the problem, I think, with a lot of this is for the general lay public who want to understand all these issues, there's no easy source. Parts of it are in one place, parts of it are in another place. Other issues in the book are scattered throughout big, heavy, scholarly tomes. And I wanted to bring together a simplified explanation that not only tells you what they believe, what scholars believe, but why they believe certain things. They tell you in a summary fashion, and then they don't really give you any detail. They maybe devote a sentence here or there. But there are a lot of issues across many topics that are all related, and I wanted to bring them all together in one place in a simple, easy-to-understand manner, so that the general lay public would understand what these issues are, because not too many of them are familiar with the scholarly split between what the public knows or believes and what the scholars believe. So I was hoping to see if I can bridge that gap.
Yeah, and you do a very good job in a short amount of time and pretty much covering all the issues that, like you said, scholars have to deal with. But what exactly are some of the problems that every New Testament scholar has to deal with when studying the four Gospels?
Well, there are two primary issues from a historical standpoint. One is, what is the original text, or how close to the original text can we get? We have no original gospel manuscript. We don't have complete gospels for several centuries in manuscripts. So we have an enormous number of contradictory manuscripts. We have thousands of handwritten Greek manuscripts, but every single one is different from every other one in some way, whether it's typographical errors or what would be scribal errors, in copying versus deliberate changes. So one issue is, how close to the original text can we get? The second is, what in the original text is historical and what isn't historical? How much has been added, what's been changed. How reliable are the sources, to the extent we can determine sources, and so forth. And so on the historical level, you have those two issues. For theologians, there's an enormous number of issues that they have to resolve. And as you can tell from modern times, with hundreds, if not thousands, of Christian sects, groups, divisions, and so on, there's a lot of debate and argument over what the Gospels actually say and mean.
Gary, when exactly do we begin hearing about the four Gospels in history?
The earliest apparent reference to the existence of Gospels. In Luke, he makes reference to sources, but he doesn't tell us what those sources were. By implication, based on the analysis we do here, he knew Mark, maybe knew something that wasn't one of the four Gospels, and some scholars, a very small number, think he may have known Matthew. But he doesn't say that, and he doesn't tell us what he's using. He merely indicates there are sources. Early in the 2nd century, there's a fellow named Papias who was interested in collecting information about what earlier church fathers and leaders had said or did. He doesn't seem to be overly interested in written materials, and he doesn't seem to know initially anything about Gospels or even written sources. But he talks to somebody who tells them that they heard about a document written by somebody named Matthew and a document by someone named Mark. He's told that Mark may have been something or interpreter of Peter. From the information, very minimal information, almost nothing that he provides in the references, we can't say anything about whether these two documents he's talking about actually are anything connected to the original Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew. It's a hook that a lot of theologian sources hang on to try to make a case. But it turns out, one thing that doesn't get commented on very much is there was another gospel at about that very same time in the same area that Papias is located, called the Gospel of Peter. Was used as scripture in a number of churches in Syria and elsewhere, and held on for quite a while, for most of the 2nd century, until it was subsequently declared heretical. And it's very possible that what was described as the Mark's book may have been the Gospel of Peter rather than the Gospel of Mark. But we have no quotes of any sort to tell us what he's referring to. And also, Papias, whose writing is only quoted in the 4th century by Eusebius, and he's our source for this, doesn't have a very high opinion of Papias as an intellect, and describes him as not particularly bright. But he does have the writings, and so there we have a reference. Towards the end of the 2nd century, we start to hear church fathers writing about what appear to be the Gospels, and starting to guess at who may have written them and assigning names. It's very likely that Papias was an influence on many of them, and they came to believe that there was a Gospel written by Matthew and a Gospel written by Mark, who was associated with Peter. And they started using that as an initial reference and coming to some kind of guesses about John and Luke. Luke was kind of probably came to be thought of as an author, possibly because of the controversial, what they call the we passages in Acts, in which as it appears on the surface, the author is talking about we did this and we did that, referring to Paul and whoever the other we is. It's not clear that this was his we referred to the author as much as the author quoting a source that said we. So there was sort of a theory that there was a Luke who was a companion to Peter, therefore this must be the person who wrote Acts and Luke and so on. So we have some guesses. And then there were guesses about John based on theories about who the beloved disciple might have been and so on. So it's around the end of the 2nd century that you start getting these guesses. But nobody really knew. They say, well, it's a tradition. I stick to the tradition, but nobody really knew. And these guesses started getting repeated by other writers, and after a while it was just taken for granted. But there were other Gospels around and other books being considered that didn't get into the subsequent canon.
Yeah, before we get into that, don't people, especially a lot of fundamentalists, or I guess you would say, you might say Jews for Jesus, go back and say that Papias shows that Matthew might have been written first in Aramaic, but obviously it really doesn't have any weight to it, does it?
Well, it's almost impossible for that to have been the case based on the Greek. If, he's writing in Greek, copying from Mark in a large amount, which is one of the issues that comes up. It's almost all scholars believe that Matthew copied about half of his gospel in large part from Mark, adapting, modifying it, and making little changes here and there, and took almost 80% of Mark into his own gospel. And so you'd have the problem of how he could copy from Mark in Aramaic, Mark writing in Greek, copying it and writing a gospel in Aramaic that gets translated into Greek, and then so closely follows the Greek Mark. It's too problematic an issue for that to be the case. It just doesn't work. But there was an Aramaic version of Matthew circulating, but it's secondary. There was a Jewish sects, for example, Jewish Christians like the Nazarenes and such, took Matthew in as their gospel, because it's probably the most Jewish-oriented gospel of the four. Adopted it, but it looks like, the Nazarenes and other Jewish Christian groups that used Matthew edited out the birth stories. They didn't believe in the birth stories. They believed that they believed Jesus was the adopted son of God, who was an ordinary human, and after he was born, God adopted Jesus as his son, and that was the theory of the Jewish Christian groups that had an Aramaic version of Matthew.
And Gary, do we really know why these Gospels, just four among many other Christian Gospels that were read by different communities, were chosen in the end? Can we simplify it as simply the vagaries of Irenaeus?
Probably not. The likelihood is these were the four earliest influential ones. Chronologically, while there may have been 30 or more Gospels written in the early Christian years, almost all of them post-date these four. The two that come closest as chronological rivals would probably be the Gospel of Peter, which may have been contemporary with John and Luke, but might have been a little later, although some scholars would date it before any of the other four Gospels. And similarly with the Gospel of Thomas, which also probably could have been contemporary with John and maybe Luke, and could have been earlier, could have been later. Again, that's an argument that some scholars make, although the consensus is that Peter and Thomas were probably early second century rather than mid-first. So on the basis of priority and reputation, those are the four Gospels that were adopted.
And it's still very much a consensus that Mark is not only the earliest, but the date of 70 AD is pretty much still stuck loyal.
the consensus, at least among historians, is overwhelming that Mark is the first of the four Gospels to be written, for reasons I go into in the book. The dating is fluid. The tendency is to move him later rather than earlier. There is a faction that would argue for a pre-revolt, the Jewish revolt in 68, 64, 67, 66. That it might have been written before, but it's not believed. There are some clues in Mark, for example, that there might have been issues of Christian persecution under Nero at the time, or in the background of writing, which would move Mark later. The tendency is to generally among historians currently to move Mark after the revolt rather than during. For a while, the idea was that he was writing during the Jewish revolt, but the tendency now is to move him later.
And that's one of the reasons why people date the Pauline epistles earlier, because Paul has no idea about the Second Temple being destroyed or anything like that.
Right. There doesn't appear to be anything in Paul that suggests knowledge of the Gospels. He even claims that he originated the revelation of the Eucharist in one of his writings. He says, you got that from me. There are some issues that seem to suggest Paul is writing in this earlier period. It's generally thought that much his earliest documents date to around 50.
Gary, what exactly is the Synoptic Problem you write about in your book?
The Synoptic Problem is this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because when you put them alongside each other, there seems to be a great amount of material that's similar. Two kinds of similarities. One is there's a lot of similarities. There's a large number of stories that are the same, and many of these stories use a lot of the same key words and phrases in all three Gospels. In addition, there's a large degree of sequential agreement, so that not only do the stories use a lot of the same words and same concepts, but they appear in the same order. Now, this isn't perfectly so throughout all the Gospels. For the most part, you find that sometimes there are variations, and when you have variations, as a general rule in all the important areas, you find either Mark and Matthew agree against Luke, or Mark and Luke agree against Matthew. But you almost never find Matthew and Luke agreeing against Mark. So this for a number of reasons then, this leads scholars to believe that Matthew and Luke must have used Mark as a source, because otherwise you would have more agreement between Matthew and Luke against Mark. But overwhelmingly, the agreement is usually Mark is the pivot around which things work. The problem is in part that the reason it's a theory that's almost universally accepted, but still a theory, is that there's a few cases known as the minor agreements. There's a few places where they're in very minor areas where Matthew and Luke do seem to agree against Mark. While the solution isn't considered a perfect solution, it's that Mark was first and the other two copied. It's overwhelmingly accepted that this is the most likely solution and the most probable solution to the problem. And of course, this has consequences if that's the case. If, for example, it's alleged in church circles that Matthew was one of the apostles. But if he was one of the apostles, it doesn't make a lot of sense that he would copy almost 80% of Mark into his own gospel, and that would make up almost half of his own gospel, and that he would copy maybe another 20% from what is considered to be another source. And then if you take away the birth stories, there's not very much left in Matthew that's unique to Matthew. There are a few things unique to Matthew, but not a lot. So that undermines the idea that Matthew must have been an apostle.
And this other source is considered Q. Is that still a popular theory?
Yeah, Q it is almost close to universal among scholars that there was a Q source. Q is a nickname. It's from a German word called the German word Quelle, which means source. The first letter is a Q. The Q theory is that there are a number of places in Matthew and Luke that share a lot of agreement, much like with the Synoptic Problem in Mark, that don't appear in Mark. So you have Matthew and Luke having a large amount of material that seems to be similar, much of it in the same order, but not all of it. And the idea is there was an earlier source, of what they call a saying source, that mostly consisted theoretically of sayings or statements by Jesus. And that this statement was used, and this source was used and known to both Matthew and Luke. There's a small minority that believe that an alternative explanation is that Luke knew Matthew and would have copied from Matthew, and that would explain the similarities.
And this Q community doesn't seem to be interested in the crucifixion of Jesus. They're more interested in just his wisdom sayings more than anything.
Right, to the extent that Q can be reconstructed from the agreements in Matthew and Luke, there's no passion account, there's no resurrection account. If I remember correctly, there may not even be a baptismal section. But primarily, they don't seem to be concerned with, at least the Q source to the extent it's reconstructed, they don't seem to be concerned with the death of Jesus. They're more concerned with what he taught when he was alive.
And it would be pretty radical to say, and there are radical scholars who say that the Gospel of Thomas might have been closer to Q or the actual Q.
There seems to be some agreement that Thomas may have known the Q source or something similar to a Q source, and that there are some parallels in Thomas to Q. And then it becomes an argument as to what that means. If there's some agreement between Thomas and Q, you raise a priority question, who came first, and stuff, issues of that sort. But generally, it's still thought that Thomas is late, and it's possible Thomas got his Q material not from Q, but from one of the other Gospels.
And what's interesting, Gary, is that if Mark was the first Gospel, Mark and scholars pretty much agree that the resurrection part of Mark is a later addition, that it ends with the woman being silent, and that's the end of the story. So isn't that sort of a problem, that Mark is basically saying, we don't know what happened to Jesus?
Well, the problem is this. The last 12 verses of Mark do not appear to be original to Mark. They are added at a later time, possibly to harmonize Mark with the other Gospels. It ends before the resurrection. It's pretty much agreed upon by scholars that the last 12 verses aren't part of the original Mark, and there are problems with the 12 verses in context. So you then have Mark ending abruptly with Mary being told, don't say anything, and she says nothing to no, and it says she said nothing to anybody, and then it ends abruptly. The argument then becomes, among scholars, did Mark intend to end there, or did something happen to keep Mark from finishing? But we have a gospel that ended without the resurrection story, and that creates a significant issue for theology and history.
Gary, do we know why John is so different from the Synoptics, and is there any evidence that he had any knowledge of them?
There is an argument among Johannine scholars as to how much John may or may not have known about the other Gospels, particularly Mark. In the book, I point out that there's a section of John that seems to have a very close affinity to Mark in parallel stories. And scholars debate whether this means that they knew each other or what. And it's also argued that if John knew Mark, he used them in a very unusual way. There's a significant theological difference between John and Mark in that in Mark, Jesus's messianic reputation is private, not public, and nobody knows while he's alive who he really is. He goes around, he's always telling everybody, don't say anything. He even denounces Peter for not understanding who he was and getting it wrong and thinking of him as an earthly Messiah the way most Jews would have thought of the Messiah. So it's a secret. It's referred to as the Messianic secret in Mark. There's no public claim of any sort that Jesus is the Messiah. In John, there's a very public claim that Jesus is the Messiah. Particularly interesting is in John, two major things missing from Mark that are in John, or two problems about John versus Mark, is that while Mark and the other Synoptic Gospels have a lot of exorcisms, there are no exorcisms in John. And in John, Jesus is very public about his mission, and there are the what they call the I am sayings, many sayings in John about I am this, I am that. And this is a public declaration. And I am, interestingly, is the title of God in Exodus. You know, when Moses asks who you are, he gives the name I am. So basically, Jesus is going around using a title associated with the God in Exodus, the Jewish God in Exodus, I am. And that raises, and John as a later gospel has got a more advanced Christology than you have in the earlier gospels. There's a lot of evolution of thinking about who Jesus was, and there's a lot of debate even among the inner circles as to who Jesus was, what his, how do you identify Jesus in what way? And that was an evolving thing. John is much later in the end result, so represents a more advanced Christological thinking than the earlier Gospels do.
And also, don't you point out in your book, Gary, that the passion narratives in Luke and John are very similar?
Yes. There seems to be some indication that John and Luke knew a common source for the passion. Whether John got it from Luke, whether Luke got it from John, or both knew an independent source, there's clearly many places where there are a lot of parallels between John and between John and Luke on the passion. At the same time, Luke knows Mark's passion account. And you get in a sense when you read Luke's passion that he's trying to mediate between the version in John and the version in Mark. One interesting example of a real passion problem between John and Mark, moderated by Luke, is that while Mark has an initial nighttime trial of Jesus by the Jewish Sanhedrin, such a trial would have been illegal under Jewish law and was not likely to have taken place. John has absolutely no Jewish trial of Jesus. There is, after he's arrested, there is no Jewish trial at all. So there is no nighttime trial of Jesus and John. Luke has a trial taking place, but has it the next day during the day, making it consistent with the Jewish law that there cannot be a nighttime trial. And so, sort of somewhere in between John and Mark. Between John and Mark on the question of what took place at that night.
You also give a very fascinating reconstruction of the conversation, if you would, between Pilate and Jesus. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I thought it was a great section.
Yeah, you have a lot of interesting issues. You start off, Mark has a very simple thing. Jesus says, "What did you do?" And Pilate just asks him "Are you the Messiah, and what did you do?" Jesus refuses to answer one question and, denies being the Messiah on the other. And in John, you have the same two questions and the same two answers, but not in connection with each other. John has a much longer dialogue between Pilate and Jesus. And so in trying to try to get the context together, it looks like things are out of order and things have been moved around. And I try to see what would happen if we tried to reconstruct the dialogue in common with Mark, so that, where Jesus, the answers Mark gives for Jesus in John appear to different questions. And the questions that Mark has Pilate asked Jesus, generate different answers in John. So I sort of tried to reconstruct how this might have taken place, what really happened, and what issues would have been there in order to reconstruct it. One of the problems is that in Mark, which is very brief, Jesus accuses Pilate of making an accusation, and Pilate didn't make an accusation. In John, you get the accusation, Jesus reacting to it. So there's a lot of tricky questions in there, and the information in John, it looks like it's out of order. And at the same time, the conversation with the Jews looks like it's out of order. Question and answers have been moved around. So when you start doing that and reconstructing, you see that John must have been using a written source that he has altered. Yeah, I explain it in more detail in the book. It's hard to follow in a brief conversation, but I lay it out clearly in the book.
Another great insight that you bring in your book, Who Wrote the Gospels, and obviously this happens because all of us have a tendency of just harmonizing the four Gospels. From years of being raised Catholic, it just kind of runs together. But what you point out, what is pretty amazing, is I believe it's in Luke and John, it seems to be that Pilate doesn't hand over Jesus to the Roman guards, but he directly hands him over to the Jews to be sacrificed.
Right. John and Luke are constructed to make Jews the ones who give the impression. It's designed linguistically to give the impression that at the end of the trial, Pilate handed Jesus over to the Jews, which contradicts the whole story of the dialogue between Pilate and the Jews and John, who say they can't kill anybody, and that's why Pilate has to do the trial. But it's linguistically structured so that the reference, who he handed Jesus over to, looks like the Jews rather than the Roman soldiers. And Luke even has a later point to emphasize that it was the Jews who did this, not the Romans. In Mark, it's very clear that Jesus was turned over to the Romans. But what Mark does, very interestingly, is he exonerates Pilate from the mocking and taunting of Jesus. While in John and Luke, it happens during the interrogation. The Roman soldiers mock Jesus and persecute Jesus. And Pilate is fully aware of this and basically a participant in the proceedings. In Mark, Pilate is exonerated. Jesus is handed over to the Romans. Pilate leaves the scene. And it's at that point that Mark has the Roman soldiers mocking Jesus. So you have an interesting question now, which is the more likely story? Is it more likely that Pilate had nothing to do with this and John and Luke chose to add in all this stuff? Or is it more likely that the persecution and mocking of Jesus occurred during the interrogation with Pilate's knowledge, and Mark altered the story to exonerate Pilate so that there wouldn't be any problems with the Romans? It's an important and interesting question about the order of events in the story.
But needless to say, and I think, and you touch upon this on your book, well, you deal with this in your book, The Judas Brief. Each of the four evangelists were, in a way, sort of trying to get the Romans off the hook and slowly trying to blame the Jews for all of Jesus' travails.
It's clear from the evolution of Christian writing through the Gospels and other sources that Jews were increasingly blamed for the death of Jesus, and the Romans were increasingly exonerated. So I think you can almost use as a historical guide the principle that where there are two versions of a story in the Gospels, one that shows the Romans more guilty of persecution, or one which shows the Jews less guilty, that those that show the Jews as less guilty or the Romans more guilty are more likely the original versions of the story, and that the exonerations of the Romans or the enhancement of punishment by enhancement of the insults to the Jews are more likely later additions.
And Gary, did each of the four Gospels have a certain agenda or audience that may have influenced how they redacted or modified their own work? I think you mentioned Matthew was more focused on a Jewish community. I think he says he wrote it for a diaspora Jewish crowd in Antioch. What about the other Gospels?
Well, Mark, although we don't know for sure where he wrote, it's very possible he wrote from Rome. And there are hints of Nero's persecution having occurred prior to Mark's Gospel. So Mark may be writing from a perspective to give hope to the Christians who have been persecuted. At the same time, he wants to eliminate any idea that Christians want to overthrow the Romans in order to minimize any impact. So in Mark's Gospel, there is no public claim by Jesus, basically, that he is the Messiah or that his goal is to get rid of the Romans or anything like that. He wants to leave the Christians as non-antagonistic to Rome. So you do have that kind of a theme playing out in Mark. I mean, there's many other themes, of course, but Mark's Gospel goes out of its way to emphasize that there was no public claim during Jesus' mission that he was the Messiah. Whatever claims he made were based on teachings, and ultimately Jesus denounces Peter for not even understanding what his mission was about shortly before the crucifixion, shortly before Passion Week. Matthew clearly structures his gospel in a way to suggest a Jewish setting. Although he's writing to the people outside of the Jewish homeland, he's writing in Greek, not in Aramaic, where Aramaic would have been the Jewish homeland, Greek is in the diaspora. He structures his story in a lot of ways around the story of Moses. The birth story of Jesus in Matthew is clearly a variation of the birth story of Moses in the Exodus. The Sermon on the Mount is clearly a parallel to Moses handing down the law, and it talks about how to understand the commandments and so on. So there's clearly a Mosaic tradition. In Matthew, Jesus says, this teaching is just for Israel, stay away from the Samaritans, stay away from the Gentiles. In Matthew, Jesus says, the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses, do what they tell you. They know what Moses wants. So it's clearly a very Jewish-oriented gospel. At the same time, Matthew's community is clearly in conflict with mainstream Judaism. It's a Jewish Christian group of sorts that's conflicted with the Jews, other than the mainstream Jews. So there's a lot of polemic against the Jewish establishment in Matthew. So you have that conflict going on. Luke is clearly writing for a Gentile audience to spread the word that the message of Jesus is a Gentile message, that salvation was originally given to the Jews, but they blew it, and now it's given to the whole world, including the Gentiles. John's gospel reflects a lot of, a more advanced understanding of who Jesus was, or a more advanced Christology about Jesus, connected with some indications that his community was running into a lot of conflicts with Jewish leadership, that it was a very Jewish-oriented group at one time that wanted to go to Jewish synagogues, but conflicts began to develop in the communities where they were located with the regular Jewish community, and they were being kicked out of the synagogues. So you have a sense that John's community was originally a very Jewish community, but they ran into conflict over the teachings. You also have in John a significant indication of a Samaritan connection. In John, Jesus goes into the Samaritan community and develops a big following there. So it's been thought that a lot of Samaritans were part of the base of John's community. In Matthew, Jesus says, don't go to the Samaritans. In John, Jesus is with the Samaritans. So you have that kind of a agenda. And as I mentioned earlier, John also has a lot of, in my opinion, associations with the Exodus chapters and teachings in Exodus, and a lot of parallels to that.
Yeah, and something we probably should have mentioned at the beginning, and you point out in your book, is when dealing with the dating, especially the late dating and the destruction of the Second Temple, is that Jesus, his foes are the Pharisees, and not so much the Sadducees. And that has to do because the Sadducees, they didn't make it out of the war, but the Pharisees did.
Right. That's one of the very unusual problems which helps date the Gospels late. The priesthood was a Sadducee priesthood. They were the ones, and they are the villains depicted in the Gospels, urging the crucifixion of Jesus according to the Gospel accounts. But you hear virtually nothing. The Sadducees are almost invisible throughout all four Gospels. Luke knows that this priesthood was Sadducee, but doesn't mention it in his Gospel. He lets it slip in the book of Acts, you learn that they're Sadducees, but it's clear that the Gospel writers don't know very much about the Sadducees at all. I mean, if they did, they were the ones who were allegedly urging the crucifixion. Why aren't they being depicted more hostilely in the Gospels? So it suggests that the Gospels are being written at a time when the Sadducees already have been left the scene, and the Gospel authors don't really have a good historical understanding of what took place in Israel during Jesus' lifetime. After the revolt in 66 through 70, so on, when the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees disappeared after the revolt because a lot of the groups were wiped out in the revolt. But the Pharisees regained influence after the revolt. They were authorized to establish a intellectual community, a school, teaching, and they became the forerunners of rabbinical Judaism. They were the ones in major conflict intellectually with the Christian community, the Jewish Christian community, the Gentile Christian community, and there would have been some really, I'm sure there would have been some astoundingly violent, verbally violent debates over the meaning of Scripture. The Christians were using mostly the Greek translation of Scripture, which differs in many ways from the Hebrew version of Scripture. So the Pharisees would have been arguing from the Hebrew version. The Christians would have been arguing frequently from the Greek version, and it would have led to a lot of fascinating debates and arguments. But because the Pharisees became the opponents of Christianity in the post-revolution period after the destruction of the temple, they are shouldering the primary blame.
And Gary, what are some of the textual schools of antiquity, and how do they influence our modern Bibles?
Well, obviously, Christianity established some footholds in many communities throughout the Roman and non-Roman world. We don't hear a lot about the non-Roman areas, but there was a large spread community. One of the chief intellectual centers of the ancient world was in Alexandria, Egypt. Many of the early church fathers came from Egypt, from Alexandria, or parts of Africa, North Africa. And another large area was places like Antioch, which had huge Jewish and Gentile communities. Within a lot of these intellectual areas, you have scribal communities. So you have in Alexandria, there was a scribal community that started producing Christian works, particularly the Gospels. And the study of those manuscripts that we've recovered from those areas, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, show that these were really competent scribes, really good at it. So these manuscripts coming out of that tradition are thought to have been among the best exemplars of what the original Gospels might have looked like. Similar manuscripts came out of other areas. Then, at some point, probably in the 2nd century, one of the things that started happening is scribes, in addition to making changes for theological purposes, started harmonizing manuscripts to try to eliminate difficulties between the 4 Gospels. And one such kind of manuscript developed in Syria and became known as the Syrian manuscript. And it was more a harmonization rather than an original manuscript. It wasn't taking an original manuscript and preserving it. We don't have any original manuscripts of the Gospels, and it wasn't based on any one source. It was taking Gospels and such and various manuscripts and creating a new manuscript of what the Gospels should be. And that eventually got to be adopted in Constantinople after the Christianity became the dominant religion under Constantine and so on, and the councils started meeting. So they wanted a text to use for the Christian community, and this Syrian manuscript was adopted in Byzantium, where there was an active scribal community, a big intellectual community, and that manuscript started getting turned out in huge amounts and spreading throughout the Roman Empire, where Constantinople was influential. And those are the overwhelming dominant manuscripts that we have, but they aren't. They were created from a harmonization of manuscripts rather than from a particular work with antiquity in it.
And don't you say that the King James Bible is actually
Right.
based on an inferior manuscript?
Right. What happened was this Byzantine manuscript spread out and was the dominant manuscript. Then there came the point in the 16th century where King James and others wanted to create a manuscript, a gospel, a written, printed manuscript of the Bible, of the New Testament. And they ran into a problem. We don't have a Greek manuscript of the New Testament. We have bits and pieces, we have certain copies that disagree with each other and aren't always complete, And they ran into a problem of how to create a Greek manuscript to be the manuscript that they translate from, or to preserve. What is the closest thing we can come to a Greek manuscript of the original New Testament? So they started to collect some of these manuscripts. They were Byzantine, this later version, poor quality at the time of what they had, according to scholars who study this. And they began to edit them and make corrections and integrate and make changes, fixing errors, grammatical errors, and all kinds of copy errors, typos and words with Greek scholar like Erasmus and others. And eventually they came up with a text to be the Greek version of is what they believe to be the closest thing to the Greek version of the Gospels and the New Testament in general. Variations of that started to appear and being printed and introduced, and one of them became the basis for later scriptures and was adopted as the chief official manuscript, although what was originally what Bart Ehrman calls a jacket blurb about this is the authentic, unchanged, unaltered manuscript. So the text we have that became the basis of King James and most modern religious translations is not based on an authentic ancient manuscript. It's a variation. Then, over the centuries, after that was done, they started finding other manuscripts and collecting manuscripts and began to notice differences in many important areas, many changes and many differences. And they began to collate these manuscripts and try to figure out which manuscripts had what was likely the earliest version and which manuscripts looked to be changes. And eventually, this became as we uncovered more and more manuscripts, this became a more and more refined art. And while there are still debates and disagreements, we now have basically a general Greek manuscript that differs in many ways from the Byzantine manuscript, or what they call the majority text for the most part, behind the King James and others. And so we have competing underlying Greek translations, a scholarly version and the traditional version. While there isn't complete agreement on what should be in the scholarly version, there's a large consensus on most of it. And there are differences between it and the traditional majority text that create some interesting problems in retrospect. And so today, they're the two main manuscript traditions. And so before you can translate a manuscript for the Bible, you have to pick one of the versions to use.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Gary. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your new and I thought very, very great book, Who Wrote the Gospels?
Thanks. It's been good to be back.
And again, I hope to have you on back. And thanks again, and good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Gary Greenberg on a mouthful, but still just a taste from his capital new book, Who Wrote the Gospels? Why New Testament Scholars Challenge Choice Traditions. Like I said, this is a book you can read in one evening and know more than 90% of Christians out there. Gary is also the author of The Judas Brief, The Moses Mystery, The Egyptian Origins of the Jewish People, and 101 Myths of the Bible, How Ancient Scribes Invented Biblical History, as well as president of the Biblical Archaeology Society of New York. For more information on Gary and his provocative and evocative work, please visit his website, bibleandhistory.com. And don't forget to download his other two appearances on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, number 101, where he discussed the Judas brief, which revealed that the Gospels were cruelly modified to wholesale blame the Jews for the death of Jesus and exonerate the Romans like toga-wearing Casey Anthony's. And number 93, where Gary discussed 101 myths of the Bible, where he ties in almost every story of the Old Testament to a previous Egyptian or Sumerian myth. Personally, I'm more in the radical camp of dating and authorship and anything-ship when it comes to the 4 Gospels, as well as a bit radical with the Gnostic Gospels. But my views have altered throughout my stay as your Charon here at the virtual Alexandria, since I believe modification of thought goes along with spiritual transformation. But for a good compliment to Gary's scholarship, I would download Aeon Byte number 79, Was There a Historical Jesus? And Aeon Byte number 174, Dating and Deciphering the Gospels, both with a Charia S or DM Murdoch. Either way, anything is possible, even if a historical Jesus isn't possible. Like Robert Price always says, until we invent a time machine, we're just orbiting the real truth. And his quote is inspired by a short story we both love called Behold the Man by Michael Moorcock, where a dude does exactly that, invents a time machine and goes back to the 1st century. And it's amazing what he finds, my beloved truth seekers. I'd like to end your suffering by my monologue by quoting from Philip K. Dick, which ties in with what I spoke about earlier on the reason of the divine, Jesus, and gnosis as in direct experience. Sorry, neo-Gnostics, it never was direct experience, or we wouldn't have all these heavens and hells, aeons and archons, stars and planets, levels of initiation, and so forth. Nothing radical, but following the same traditions of Buddhist mystics, Neoplatonists, Merkaba and Kabbalist Jews, and even many Platonic-minded Christians. Anyway, here it is. Since the universe is actually composed of information, then it can be said that information will save us. This is the saving gnosis which the Gnostics sought. There is no other road to salvation. However, this information, or more precisely the ability to read and understand this information, the universe as information, can only be made available to us by the Holy Spigot. We cannot find it on our own. Thus it is said that we are saved by the grace of God and not by good works, that all salvation belongs to Christ, who, I say, is a physician. Let us heal each other, we Christ in the becoming. Why? Because we are the Gnostics, the lovers of the esoterica and the Dionysian freethinkers. We are the veterans of 1,000 psychic wars who have set the controls to the heart of the sun. We are Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas, beckoning with one hand to our brothers and sisters to come out of the river Styx, while with the other giving the finger to the idiot quoting that saying about an idiot pointing at the moon, when in reality it's just Jehovah showing us his galactic ass. We are existentialist Galahads, crushing grails instead of saving them, because we're done with bad romance. Troubadours of infernal poetry, and those sailors on the seas of fate through the gnashing rocks of orthodoxy, all the way to the farthest shores of imagination. We are legend. We are the revenge of the myth. We are one by the bonds of our individuality. Thank you again for coming to keep me company with the prostitutes, tax collectors, lepers, and other outcasts of a hopelessly sick society. Well, maybe not the tax collectors. but thank you. I am Abraxas, broadcasting at the virtual Alexandria through the God Above God Dad Can. The road is ended, the song is over. Thought I'd have something more to say. But don't cultivate any troubles, my beloved true seekers, because like heaven above you, the spy that loved you, I'm keeping all of your secrets safe with me tonight. Hello and goodbye as always.
Look at all my trials and tribulations, sinking in a gentle pool of wine. Don't disturb me now, I can see the answers till this evening is this morning, life is fine. Always hope that I'd be an apostle. Knew that I would make it if I tried. Then when we retire, we can write the gospel so they'll still talk about us when we've died.
Just a little harder when brought about by friends. For all you care, this wine could be my blood. For all you care, this bread could be my body. The end. This is my blood you drink, this is my body you eat. If you would remember me when you eat and drink. I must be mad, thinking I'll be remembered. Yes, I must be out of my head. Look at your blank faces, my name will mean nothing. 10 minutes after I'm dead, one of you denies me, one of you betrays me. Peter will deny me. No, in not just me. A few hours, 3 times will deny me. And that's not all I see. One of you here dining, one of my 12 chosen will leave to betray me.
Cut out the dramatics, you know very well who.
Why don't you go do it?
You want me to do it?
Hurry, they are waiting.
If you knew why I do it.
I don't care why you do it.
To think I admired you, well now I despise you.
Liar, you Judas.
You wanted me to do it. What if I just stayed here and ruined your ambition? Christ, you deserve it!
Hurry, you fool! Hurry and go! Save me your speeches, I don't want to know! Go! Go!
Look at all my trials and tribulations, sinking in a gentle pool of wine. Once that in the bread, it's gone to this morning is this evening, life is fine. Always hope that I
angels fly around us.